This morning we are finishing up this series called The Sermon That Changed Everything. Greatest sermon on the face of the earth. We typically have you stand and read scripture together, but because of the heat, I already got an email from one of you saying, surely the preacher wouldn't preach a long sermon this morning. Bunch of passive-aggressive jerks attend Long Creek Baptist Church. I don't know. But we are going to jump right in to the message this morning because I think there is a lot that Jesus has to say to us, but I do also know that it is sweltering in this space, and we want to honor the fact that many of you are already panting for strawberry shortcake. The overarching principles of this sermon series, some of them are what you see before you. Some of them are like God is based towards humanity. Some of you, this was brand new to you. You were so convinced of the original sin that you had forgotten the original blessing. Do you remember that sermon way back at the very first? Blessed are you. Blessed are you. Blessed are you. And we view that not as a recipe for how to achieve blessing, but if God already declares us to be blessed, then there we are. The third one down, a holy conscience demands more than law. Jesus, through this whole sermon, is asking people not to comply with law, but to be transformed into holiness. God leads his people from captivity to freedom, and he continues to do so. He's doing that right here in this place, week after week after week. But this morning, we're going to look at the reality that Christ confesses his kingship. What a weird word to use. Christ confesses his kingship. Jesus doesn't announce it in a typical way like the angels did outside of Bethlehem. Jesus confesses it in 3 paragraphs here in Matthew chapter 7, and we're going to discuss that. But before we do, because it's hot and this seems like a good Sunday for Church History 101, I thought I would tell you a story. 2 stories, actually. The first one happens about 550 to 600 years before Jesus. There were 3 men named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Do you remember this story? This story is one of these stories that has been argued to be a fable. Much of the book of Daniel is argued to be a fable. The problem is that even Babylonian literature, in other words, the bad guys, even recorded these guys' stories. So it's not just fables that good Jewish people or Hebrews or Christians made up, and we can't defend where the stories come from. Even the enemies affirm that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were given places of power under King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar, as you might remember the story, built this beautiful idol of himself, and with the appointed time, he said, when the trumpet blasts, everybody is to bow down and worship this idol. Do you recall this? The 3 guys, they remained standing. They said that we will not worship this God, and so they were eventually, after some intense fellowship, we call it in marital counseling, they were thrown into a fiery furnace. And before they went in, they said, my God, our God will rescue us, but even if he doesn't, we will not bow down to another one. It's a powerful story. It's a powerful story not just about picking a religion, but worshiping one God, which is incredibly politically incorrect. Fast forward to shortly after Jesus, 203 years after the Common Era began, this young girl, 18 years old, by the name of Perpetua, she was assassinated by the Romans. She was arrested and killed because she worshiped Jesus. Even worse than that, she worshiped only Jesus. This is where it gets offensive. It's one thing for us in our culture to worship Christ. It's another thing to declare Christ is the only one we will worship, isn't it? Oh, go on, isn't it? It changes the dynamic so that we now are all of a sudden bigots, or we're racist, or we're narrow. And so, out of some of these debates and conversations and true life events, we have what's called Christian particularism. Say it to your neighbor on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Christian particularism. You were just mumbling. You were just saying watermelon, watermelon, watermelon. On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, Christian particularism versus religious pluralism. Religious pluralism says that all religions are equally valid and all religions are equally true. So there's a whole bunch of different ways to get to God. Jesus is incredibly politically incorrect here in Matthew chapter 7 because in 3 different stories, he shoots that down. The religious pluralist would say, no, really, it doesn't matter. As long as you're good enough, then surely you will get to heaven. But Christian particularists say, no, unfortunately, the evidence is incredibly stacked against you. Let's just take an example. I'm going to pull up 2 religions, 2 of the major world religions, and we're going to highlight the difference just between those 2 for a moment. Are we okay with this? Not judging the other religions. We're just going to articulate what their core beliefs would be. So we're going to take Islam and Buddhism, 2 religions that PEI should know a little something about because our population is rapidly changing when it comes to the demographic that subscribe to Muslim or Islam and Buddhism. So on the left, Islam believes in a personal God, that God created the world, that man is sinful, that our eternal destiny is either heaven or hell, and we achieve heaven by our faith and our good works. Not bad teaching. We're not theological pals, don't get too excited about it, but not terribly bad teaching. But just look at Buddhism. Buddhism would say there is not a personal God. The earth has not been created. Man is not sinful. There is no enduring destiny, and the goal is not eternity, it is annihilation. Just these two cannot both be true. The only way we can say that all religions are the same is if we're so dependent on them being not the same that we will argue it and check our mind at the door. It's the only way. You cannot honestly look at these 2 doctrines and say, well, surely they simply, ladies and gentlemen, are not. Into the fray comes Jesus. In Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 through 37, he gives 4 paragraphs. If you turn in your Bibles, you can, but I'm going to have them thrown up here as well, where Christ demonstrates that he alone is unwandering, unwavering, and unshakable. He is the only one, he claims, that is the entrance point into this kingdom called eternal living. And for us as a Christian church, this is an incredibly unpopular message. If only we could shift and say, Jesus is one of the ways. If only we could embrace religious pluralism and say, you know what? Yeah, as long as you're good enough. But who defines this? In some cultures, good enough means supplying for your family's needs. Full stop. Doesn't matter how you do it. Other cultures, there's more conscience involved. Other cultures, the standards move around. But Christ here wanders into the fray, and he makes these declarative statements that are not debatable. He is saying, I am the way to be saved. Let's jump in. Unwandering. Enter through the narrow gate, Jesus says, Matthew 7, for wide is the gate. Broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. When I was a kid, this is going to date me so badly, but when I was a kid, I used to watch WWF wrestling. It was called WWF back then. That shows you how old I am. I had 3 real heroes. Macho Man Randy Savage, Hulk Hogan, because everybody had to love Hulk Hogan, and Andre the Giant. I love these guys. I would watch religiously, probably more than I wanted to go to church. I loved WWF wrestling, and what I loved about it was there was always a clear winner. Whether I liked the winner or not, there was never a tie. It was always Hulk Hogan or Andre the Giant. Later on, it would be players like The Undertaker and some of these wannabes. But the real heroes were Macho Man, and I won't do his voice. I want to. Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. The matches were slightly predictable, weren't they? Just a little. I make fun of Hallmark movies being all the same, but some of these wrestling matches, you kind of knew. You had a sneaky suspicion that Hulk Hogan wasn't really down for 3. And he was going to rise like a phoenix from the ashes and do the flying leg drop, and poor Andre the Giant was going to be done, and it was over. There was one winner and one leader. And believe it or not, the human heart demands this. We love sports, many of us, because we love knowing there's a definitive winner. If you don't believe me, watch gold medal hockey games and watch the crisis that's happening in especially younger people when they win silver. It's a bona fide struggle. Because on one hand, we should be happy that we won silver, but on the other hand, we just lost a game. We were so close to being the definitive champion. Jesus is saying here, not that the way to be righteous is by following a narrow set of rules. That's not what he's saying at all. The whole rest of the sermon comes against that. What he is saying is the gate is a narrow entrance point. We don't get to just pick and choose whatever way we want and think it's going to be healthy. It simply is not. Jesus declares that it's very narrow. He's able to declare this because he knows he's the one who is, in fact, the gate. It's narrow in entry. Now, many of us will use this as a club to beat our unsaved neighbors. But remember, Jesus' point is to interact with you personally. Not all the people you're thinking, oh, I wish they were here this morning. The only way you are able to be righteous is by entering into a relationship with Christ. And the only way you can make progress is with a relationship with Christ. You say, Dwight, this is elementary. No, it really isn't nowadays. How many of us would, if we were in our right mind, would argue that we entered into a relationship with Christ and then started to let things get more complicated? We started playing around with religion. We started playing around with good works. We started playing around with money. We started dancing close to the line of temptation just to see how close we could get. Jesus is making a very bold statement here as the Son of God. He is declaring, you need me. Isn't it good that I preached about being politically incorrect last week? How important Jesus was setting up this part of the message. He is certainly unwandering. We don't get to wander around and find our own path to Jesus. We don't get to find our own path to eternal life. Jesus himself is declared. And if you can't handle that, then I challenge you to find a religion. I challenge you to find a way to guarantee yourself an airtight kingdom experience that is comfortable for you. I don't think you will. I'd place a bet on that, although I'm a former Wesleyan. I probably shouldn't bet on anything. Let's move on. He's unwavering. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I'll tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Now, this is where Jesus makes it really personal. It's one thing for Jesus to say, I'm a way to get to heaven. We can like that Jesus. It's when Jesus says, no, I'm the only way. We don't like him as much. He's all of a sudden too what? Narrow. He's not open-minded at all. And here's where we get into it. Not everyone who says to who? Me. Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom. What does that imply? That Jesus is the gatekeeper. He's the one. He is the one who's going to hear all of the arguments. He continues in verse 22, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, didn't we do this? There's an unwavering nature of Jesus that says, no, it is so much deeper than what you've done or what you've said. It's not just obedience, it's intimacy. Look back. Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Now, what's fascinating about this is I see people in religion all the time who are doing all kinds of good things in Jesus' name. It's not my job to judge, not at all. But where Jesus draws the line is this beautiful reality that he desires to have intimate knowledge of you. He wants to know you. Some of you who are in this place that have shared about mental health struggles, you know just how important it is to be known, don't you? You know there's no healing, there's no cure if you're doing this all alone. If you're holding truth back, if you're wearing a mask all the time. This is where, and I've shared, Marina, our journey to the AA meeting back, man, it's probably been over a decade now. Marina took me to her AA meeting one year, and I was astounded at how there were no masks being worn there. Everybody started their little speech by saying, "Hi, I'm Bob and I'm an addict." It's not that they were proud of it. They just had the freedom to be like, "Y'all know why I'm here. I'm not here in this place because I've got it all together yet and I don't need y'all anymore." And yet somehow, the church, bit by bit, has lost that. I confess to you, I'm probably partly to blame. Up until my own personal pain and trauma, I had all the leadership stuff. I had all the pedigree. I had the last name. People still think I'm related to Brent Ingersoll over at King's Church, and I just ride along on that reputation. The fact of the matter is, without fully being known and fully knowing the other, it is going to be very, very, very difficult to exist, let alone thrive, in this thing called the kingdom. Why? Because Jesus wants to know you. You say, "Dwight, oh no, you don't know me." If Jesus saw what I have said or done, even this morning in the van on my way to church with these kids, why God gave me these kids, I don't understand, and the list goes on and on. Yes, Jesus is saying the involvement in the kingdom hinges on being fully known, welcoming Christ in. And this is what he talks about. It's unwavering. He doesn't negotiate on it. And we hate him for it sometimes, but when we fully know him and we fully experience the love that Jesus has for us, that hatred melts away like snow. Finally, unshakable. This is my favorite part of the whole story because I grew up, my grandfather was a lighthouse keeper, and I've seen the power of the sea. Well, you all have too, down at Canoe Cove or at your favorite beach. Have you ever stood in the sand when the waves are coming in and felt the sand eroding away from underneath your feet? You're familiar with that feeling? Isn't it the coolest feeling in the world? Especially if you know how to swim. Jesus continues, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of whose? Of mine, and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock." Last year, when Hurricane Fiona hit, Crystal and I were in Newfoundland. Who goes to Newfoundland to get away from bad weather, right? We sailed into Port Basque the morning before Fiona hit, and I made the statement to Crystal, "I don't understand how these houses stay attached to these rocks." Four days later, we come back and we can't recognize the community. One man left his house to go out into his sun porch to open a window. The window was bowing with the vacuum pressure of these winds. He went out to open the window to take the pressure off the glass, turns around and walks the 3 paces back in. He hears a crack, and that whole side of his house is gone. The gal at the gatehouse said, 7 people working on this ferry tonight have lost their homes this week. It's not just about the rock, is it? Some of you are going through incredible storms. Storms of grief are just one. Just one storm where you wonder, where in the world is God in all of this? Or why is God present but not present enough? Or why does it hurt so bad? Jesus is not denying the existence of storms for you. He is saying and predicting the storm will come. And so for those of you who are in the storm, Jesus is saying, these words that I'm saying to you are the utter foundation that will keep you from being blown into the sea. If you hear, if you get this, and if you live it, you are going to be unshakable. Why could Jesus say this? Because he was unshakable. Jesus was unwavering. Jesus was all these things that he was encouraging his disciples to be. So he wasn't saying that the rain wouldn't fall, but everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. This is what YouTube exists for. These stories of people doing incredible dumb things are why we have the internet. You see men, especially men, doing incredibly insane things, usually with firearms or fire or height, just proving that they can survive this kind of stuff. Jesus is saying this is not a game. Your life can be destroyed if you ignore me. And he's not just speaking to the unrighteous. He's speaking to righteous people. He's speaking to people that know him and that are called according to his purpose, that are already in the kingdom. He is saying, look out. You need to listen. You need to follow, or else your life will be represented by a great crash. I wonder, when it comes to religious pluralism, if history will teach us that we're in fact unshakable or not. It might not be a big crash, it might be a quiet erosion. And the argument and the theme today is not a popular one, ladies and gentlemen, but it's still a fact. Jesus meant what he said when he called himself king, when he called himself Lord, and when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to my Father except through me. The good news is this. I have a final story. A few months ago, I had my gallbladder taken out, after I waited for countless hours to get down to the surgical floor, I was met by a friend of mine. His name is Joe. We all had masks on, and he had plastic on and a cape, I think. But he greeted me outside where they were taking my last vitals and all that, and he said, Dwight, do you remember me? I said, yeah, I remember you, Joe. He said, here's what I'm going to do. And he walked me through step by step what was going to take place through those big doors. He said, now we're going to take you out of this wheelchair and we're going to get you onto this gurney. And onto this gurney, we're going to make sure that you are sanitized, that you're iodinized and all that kind of stuff. He said, I'm going to put this sticky thing here, I'm going to put this needle there, and then we're going to put a mask on you and you're going to drift off to sleep. He said, you're going to wake up and you're not going to know where you are. It's going to feel like the room is spinning. He had this whole predictable spiel that he had given countless times. And believe it or not, at that moment, I didn't ask for options. Well, can you just dial it back a little bit? Maybe do it while I'm in the wheelchair, because I like to be able to get away from y'all. No. Forget the iodine. I don't like the stains that it leaves on my skin. So let's just roll the dice and take the chance with infection. No. Maybe, just maybe, instead of gassing me, you could just do local anesthetic so I could watch one of my body organs being sliced up and taken out of my body. That would be fun. No, Joe, you see, had the experience and the credibility to describe exactly what was going to happen and how it was going to happen, and the predictability to know this is how the outcome was going to be. What Jesus recognized in those people on that hillside that day was it was not his instruction that would be debated. It was his person. It was his credibility. And I would argue that's your challenge and mine too. when we feel like we're shaking and we wonder, is it that I don't know enough memory verses, or I haven't prayed hard enough, or any of these other things? No, let's center it back on the credibility of Jesus to never leave us and forsake us. Let's center it back on the promise that Jesus made to walk out into the storm with us instead of neglecting us or just tell us what to do from the beach. When we don't like the fact that Jesus seems so arrogant, let's remember that if we were in a hospital, we would certainly trust a credible physician who had a track record for knowing what they were doing, and if they simply said, this is what I do, this is what I know, then based on their credibility, we should listen. Is there anyone else who has such insight into the human condition and the divine nature of God other than Jesus? Jesus was not being arrogant. He was simply speaking truth. And this morning, ladies and gentlemen, our culture doesn't need us to take that truth and beat them to death with it and say, you're terrible, 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 terrible. We need to start by recognizing that we are a particular people, a Christian particular people, that says, I don't know why things are going sideways in your faith journey, but I know who holds tomorrow in my life.